Every NFL team has the same goal entering each and every year, and that of course is to win the Super Bowl. And when you think of how difficult things can be, whether on the football field or in life, that is a very simple goal. Obviously, the journey to get there is going to be trying, and there's going to be a lot of adversity, but the goal itself is simple. And as proven time and time again, the best way to win a Super Bowl is to build through the NFL draft. The Eagles' 2024 draft class featured guys like Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean, and even their 2023 draft class featured guys like Jalen Carter and Nolan Smith, and it paid off as they won Super Bowl 59, and they've done a tremendous job of building their roster largely through the NFL draft. And in today's video, we're going to break down some of the biggest draft regrets over the past few years. What we mean by this is guys who fell that shouldn't have, or teams simply drafting inferior prospects when better players were on the board. Now, for clarity, we're not going to include outliers like Brock Purdy, who of course was the final pick in the 22 draft, or Mr. Irrelevant, or even Puka Nacua, who was a 5th round pick in the 2023 draft. They each have exceeded even the wildest expectations the 49ers or Rams could have had for them, and they also weren't first round prospects or close to being first round prospects during their draft process. Instead, we are going to focus on other misses in the first few rounds of each of the past few drafts. Also, I don't want to include any obvious ones, most notably Justin Jefferson over Jalen Reagor, for example. But there is a lot to dive into in today's video, and with that preface out of the way, let's begin. And we are starting today's video with the 2022 Vikings draft class. As you'll see later in today's video, we'll discuss more specific picks, but this is dedicated to an entire class. The 2022 draft is most known for two things. One, not having a great quarterback prospect, as Kenny Pickett was the only quarterback selected in the first 2 rounds of the 2022 draft, and for how great the secondary was in this draft. Now, Brock Purdy of course became an outlier, as there was a reason he fell to the 262nd pick to begin with, and even San Francisco passed over him multiple times. But the 2022 draft class, and more specifically the secondary in this class, featured guys like Sauce Gardner, who yes is having a tough start to the 2025 season, but is still a 2-time first-team All-Pro, Derek Stingley, Kyle Hamilton, Trent McDuffie, Kirby Joseph, Deron Bland, Reek Woolen, and you get the point. This class was loaded, and there's several more players from this class too. And the Vikings had the 12th overall pick in this draft, and it wouldn't have been unreasonable for them to take any of Kyle Hamilton, Trent McDuffie, or Tyler Linderbaum with their first-round pick. All were positions of need, and all were great draft prospects, especially Kyle Hamilton. And why the Vikings are specifically in today's video is because not only did they not take a good player in this spot, they traded back with a division rival 20 spots so that the Lions could come up and take Alabama wide receiver Jameson Williams. And the trade value the Vikings got back was, in my opinion, awful, because they traded back from pick 12 to receive picks 32, 34, and 66 at the beginning in the 3rd round in exchange for picks 12 and 46. And if you were going to make this trade and trade out of a very good prospect in Kyle Hamilton, especially to a division rival, you better make sure you are winning this on the trade value chart, and they didn't. There should have been a big tax for this trade because they were division rivals, and because whoever the Lions were going to come up and get would have to play the Vikings twice a year, and the Lions made out with Aiden Hutchinson and Jameson Williams, while the Vikings added insult to injury and traded back to draft Georgia safety Lewis Cine. And because he was the 32nd pick in the draft and not a top 5 or top 10 pick, it kind of flies under the radar of just how bad of a selection and process this was. Vikings fans of course know this, but Lewis Cine is honestly an all-time draft bust, as he played 10 total defensive snaps for the Vikings before being cut prior to the 2024 season. 8 of those 10 snaps came in a blowout loss to the Packers in 2023, in a game Jaren Hall started at quarterback for Minnesota. The Vikings also drafted a corner in the 2nd round, which was Clemson's Andrew Booth. Booth played very sparingly in his first 2 years in Minnesota, as he logged a little over 250 defensive snaps in his time in the Twin Cities, before being traded to the Cowboys in exchange for corner Nashawn Wright. So for the Vikings to address the secondary not once but twice within the top 45 of the 22 draft in what could be described as a generational draft from a defensive back standpoint, as there's not many drafts that have as many good DBs as the 22 draft had, hence the very rare yet applicable use of the word generational, the Vikings whiffed on both defensive backs, and also received the honor of having to deal with Jameson Williams twice a year for the next several years. And Vikings GM Kwesi Adofo-Mensah has received a lot of criticism for his draft classes, and the 2022 draft started it all. They also selected guard Ed Ingram and linebacker Brian Asamoah inside the top 70 of the draft, and neither player is currently on the roster. And T-building starts through the draft, and a few years later, there's no doubt the Vikings have a lot of regret about the 2022 draft. And today's video is sponsored by PrizePicks and my code GFB. We were 2 of 3 on picks last week, 3 of 4 if you want to include the one with the half-yard prop, and we're looking to go 3 of 3 this week, and that is again with the season-long partner of the channel, PrizePicks. And with my Week 5 lineup using code GFB, I like Jahmyr Gibbs more than 75.5 rushing yards. Pretty straightforward. I think Detroit can pounce on Cincy, especially with the way Cincy's looked over the past couple of weeks, and I think that the Lions are going to run the ball a lot, so I think Jahmyr Gibbs will get a lot of touches, and I like more than 75.5 rushing yards. I also like Sam Darnold more than 4.5 rushing yards against Tampa, as it's 4.5 rushing yards. If an edge comes around the play one time, Sam Darnold can step up and scoot out of the pocket and pick up 5 yards to hit more than 4.5 rushing yards. I also like Ladd McConkey more than 54.5 receiving yards, and Ladd has had a slow start to the year. He only has one game with 50 or more yards in the first couple of weeks, and I think against Washington this is a good game for him to get back on track, and I like Ladd McConkey more than 54.5 receiving yards. So download the PrizePicks app and use code GFB, and when you do make your first $5 deposit, PrizePicks will give you $50 in lineups instantly. We are close to achieving the 100 sign-up goal, so if you do sign up, we will be 1% closer to the said goal, and again, that's when you use code GFB on PrizePicks. Always play responsibly, and a big thank you to PrizePicks for sponsoring today's video. Next up is a player that to this day I have no idea how he fell in the 2023 NFL Draft, and that is Lions defensive back Brian Branch. Brian Branch to me was a player that I would not have minded my team, the Minnesota Vikings, taking him at the first round where they eventually selected USC receiver Jordan Addison. He was a player that I thought was a top 15 player in the class, really top 20 at worst, and that there were far more strengths in his game than weaknesses, and I thought that Brian Branch was kind of the definition of a good football player. And whenever teams are in the NFL draft process, I think there's times where they overcomplicate the process, and if you simply draft good football players like Brian Branch, or like a player we will soon discuss on the offensive side of the football, who in some ways is kind of the Brian Branch of the offense, if you will. He does a lot of things right, while not necessarily at an elite level, but at a good enough level to still be a good football player and a guy that could make a Pro Bowl or two throughout his career. Well, Brian Branch is that guy. He's a player that you can play in the slot, you can play him at single high, you can even play at outside corner in a pinch, which the Lions have done a couple of times this year, by the way, and he's also a really good tackler that can come up and fit in the run game too. And for him to be the 46th pick in the draft is definitely something the NFL would like to do over, and there was a report that came out in late August of 2025 that the Saints, or that Mickey Loomis ruled over Jeff Ireland that he was going to take Isaiah Foskey, a pass rusher from Notre Dame, over Brian Branch, and I don't want this to be a complete slander of Mickey Loomis because he's had several questionable draft decisions, but if that is true, and by the way, that's the only confirmed draft report that we have that somebody specifically said that they took a player over Brian Branch, because there were far more questionable prospects than just taking Isaiah Foskey over Brian Branch. I have no idea what the thought process was heading into that, and why you would justify taking a player like Isaiah Foskey, who is no longer on the Saints roster, over Brian Branch when he has done everything that he's done for the Lions over the past 2 years. And for the purpose of this video, I went back and looked at a couple of numbers, and during his time in college, he played nearly 1,700 total defensive snaps for Alabama, and as you probably guessed, he missed a grand total of 4 tackles during his time with the Crimson Tide, and one of them was, funnily enough, against Bijan Robinson. So if you are going to miss a tackle against a player, I think missing a tackle against Bijan Robinson, one of only 4 that he missed in his entire collegiate career, is very acceptable, as Bijan is a Pro Bowl NFL running back, and if he stays healthy, there's a very real possibility that Bijan could have a gold jacket. Anyway, look, Brian Branch is a really good player, really good draft selection by the Lions in what was a tremendous draft class for the Lions, as not only did they bring in Brian Branch in 2023, but they also brought in Jahmyr Gibbs, an Offensive Player of the Year caliber running back, Jack Campbell, a really good linebacker who took a step from 2024 to 2025, and of course Sam Laporta, a tight end from Iowa. Now, I did bring up the Mickey Loomis part, and if I am going to criticize or make a comment about somebody else, I will at least make one about myself as well. I was very critical of the Sam Laporta selection when it was made. I thought that the Lions should have taken Michael Mayer, who I thought was a superior prospect to Sam Laporta. So if I am going to make that comment about Mickey Loomis, I am at least going to say that about myself as well, that I thought Mayer was a much better prospect than Laporta, and it turns out that Ben Johnson and now John Morton and of course Dan Campbell and Brad Holmes too by default had a plan for Laporta and they've executed perfectly, but the bottom line is Brian Branch is a tremendous player and he should have never fell to the 46th pick in the 2023 NFL Draft. The regret, to be clear for the purpose of this video, is that the NFL let that happen because he was a top 15 or top 20 player all along. And one big thing that we discuss on the channel is to just draft good football players. And what I mean by drafting good football players are players that have relatively high floors, that have very few flaws in their game. Now, that doesn't make them perfect players or the G word, generational prospects. But what I mean by this is players like Brian Branch, who you probably can assume are going to be rock solid for the next couple of years. And Brian Branch has been more than rock solid. And so has Bucs receiver Emeka Egbuka through the first couple of starts through his career. Now, this is not a shot at any team in front of the Bucs for taking Emeka Egbuka. It's more of a how did we let him fall to pick 19, because again, this was a really good player that was consistently overthought throughout the entire draft process. There were a lot of people that were basically saying, well, he's okay or he's solid, but he's never going to do this or he's never going to do that. And in some ways, he was a product of Marvin Harrison Jr., or he was a product of Jeremiah Smith, who is a really good 2027 draft prospect for the Ohio State Buckeyes, and that he's always going to be in the shadow of somebody else. And in his NFL debut against the Falcons, he had 67 yards and 2 touchdowns, and most recently in Week 4 against the defending Super Bowl champion Philadelphia Eagles, Emeka Egbuka had his first career 100-yard game. I do think that there are some teams that over the course of time will regret not drafting Emeka Egbuka, and like I said, this is not a shot at any one particular team. The Emeka Egbuka inclusion in the video is more of a respect to him because of the start to the NFL career that he's had, and I couldn't be happier for him because the Bucs have went through their fair share of injuries, unfortunately, like everyone else has to start the 2025 season, so I did at least want to include one rookie and show them some love, especially with the start to the year that Egbuka has had in Tampa, and I hope that it continues, and I think that there's a very real possibility that he's not just a 1,000-yard player in his first season, but that he could be a 1,000-yard player for the next 2 or 3 years. I'm not going to say that he's going to be the next Mike Evans and have it be for the first decade plus of his career, because that is way too far to project into the future, but it's been a very promising start to Emeka Egbuka's career, and I couldn't be happier for him and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Next up is one from the 2024 NFL Draft, and it involves a receiver who is a pretty good route runner, who's also a hardworking guy, and a real first one in, last one out type player, maybe even a guy who brings his lunch pail to work, and that of course is Ladd McConkey, going number 34 to the Chargers. I thought Ladd was a really solid prospect coming out of Georgia, and in his first year with the Chargers had over 1,100 yards and 7 touchdowns, and was one of the best receivers from the 2024 class. It was the LSU guys in Brian Thomas Jr. and Malik Neighbors, and then, of course, Ladd. And there is some draft regret from the Panthers, who took Xavier Legette at number 32 overall, and hell, even Buffalo with Keon Coleman at number 33, and honestly, you could even make a case for Kansas City too, who took Xavier Worthy at number 28 overall, as Ladd McConkey would be a tremendous player to pair with Patrick Mahomes, but the real regret is New England trading back 3 spots to take Jalen Polk from Washington. And I have no problem with a team like the Patriots trading back at that specific point in time, as they were a very bad football team in 2023, and they didn't accidentally stumble into the number 3 pick in the 2024 draft, which of course was used on Drake May. But where I do have a problem is trading back 3 spots to help another team in the conference to take an inferior player at the same position you were already targeting. Now, out of all of the receivers we mentioned during this part, starting with Worthy, I had Ladd McConkey highest on my final top 150 big board in 2024, as I had him at player 34 versus having Polk at 43 and Legette at 46. And we are a little over 20 games into these guys' careers now, and I never would have guessed that Jalen Polk would already be on his second NFL team, which only adds insult to injury for the Patriots in this specific situation. Polk finished his rookie season with just 12 receptions for 87 yards, and the Jalen Polk that we saw on tape during his rookie year looked absolutely nothing like the Jalen Polk we saw during the 2023 season with Washington, and alongside his fellow Husky teammates in Michael Penix, Rome Odunze, and Jalen McMillan, and even offensive lineman Troy Fatanu and Roger Rosengarten. With New England, he looked slow and could not win contested catches, or routes for that matter too. And in August of this year, it was announced he was going to have season-ending shoulder surgery, and less than a month later, it was announced the Patriots were trading him and a 2028 7th-round pick in exchange for a 2027 6th-round pick, which meant New England was really done with him just a little over a year into his career. And there's times in the NFL draft where, as simple as this idea is, just take the layups. You don't need to get cute and trade out of a pick to potentially draft another good player in the 3rd or 4th round to have extra draft capital when the time rolls around. I thought Ladd McConkey was a pretty straightforward evaluation. Ironically, he was a good route runner with good hands and a guy who knows how to get open. And based on where New England's current receiving situation is, Ladd McConkey was exactly what they needed, yet they traded out of drafting him so that he could become a Charger instead. The Panthers at this point probably regret drafting Xavier Legette, as he has 4 receptions for 8 yards in his second season on 15 targets, and it's been an absolute nightmare for him in 2025, though because they had Adam Thielen already on the roster, and Legette at his best is clearly a different style of player than Thielen, I can at least understand the thought process of drafting Legette in that situation, and I don't want to have this be a result of 2020 hindsight. Xavier is a player I'm shocked that has played the way he has in the NFL, but he was a height, weight, speed guy who you could get open on drags, screens, or deep crossers and get the ball in his hands, and that's a bit of a different situation, though I completely acknowledge the frustration Panthers fans have with Anthony Legette in 2025, but I also do acknowledge having Adam Thielen already on the roster when this pick was made. Now, one thing I do want to be clear about today's video is I don't want this to be revisionist history after the fact. These were decisions that, as they were happening, I had no idea why teams were making these said decisions, and obviously the Justin Jefferson and Jalen Reagor is kind of the poster child of this type of video, but I do think in some ways that the defensive version of the Justin Jefferson Jalen Reagor selection was when the Washington Commanders selected Emmanuel Forbes over Christian Gonzalez. I thought Christian Gonzalez was a really good corner prospect, and before the Eagles traded up to go get Jalen Carter with the Chicago Bears and to move up 1 pick, I originally mocked Christian Gonzalez going to the Eagles quite a bit because I thought that that was a really good pairing for the Philadelphia Eagles, and ironically the Eagles got the best of both worlds as they selected a really good defensive tackle in Jalen Carter, and Jalen Carter fell to pick 9 for off the field reasons. He didn't fall because he was the 9th best player in the class. It was pretty clear to everyone that he was a top 2 or 3 talent in the class depending on where you had him and Bijan Robinson, and he was a really good player, right? So whenever you look at this, the Eagles eventually did get Quinyon Mitchell the following year, but the reality is I thought Christian Gonzalez going in the top 10 was a very fair scenario, and whenever the Commanders had Christian Gonzalez fall into their lap, again, a player who I thought was a top 10 player in the 2023 draft, I was baffled whenever they took Emmanuel Forbes with the 16th overall pick. Now, I think looking back, the justification for the Commanders was because of how many pick sixes Emmanuel Forbes had in his collegiate career, that he was this ball hawking type player, you know, this Trayvon Diggs or Deron Bland type player that, yes, he's going to get beat a fair amount, but when he's right, and he can really flip the game at any point. And while that is a good thought process to have in some scenarios, I don't think with the 16th overall pick it's necessarily the best thought process to have, especially with a consistent, more reliable corner available in Christian Gonzalez, and that is one of the biggest reasons the Commanders make today's video. And even with the Washington Commanders in the 2022 draft, they had another baffling draft process in which they traded out of the 11th pick so that they could trade back 5 spots with the New Orleans Saints, who drafted Chris Olave, while the Commanders traded back 5 spots to take Jahan Dotson. I am also a Penn State fan, and I obviously watched both players pretty regularly throughout their collegiate careers, and never once did I think Jahan Dotson was close to being the player Chris Olave was. So from a process standpoint, I thought that that was also pretty bad by the Washington Commanders, and then they followed it up with selecting Fedarian Mathis in the 2nd round, and that was to me another baffling decision when it was made because they already had Deron Payne and Jonathan Allen on the roster, and not that I'm opposed to another big-bodied defensive tackle in the middle of your defense, but I was not a huge Fedarian Mathis fan in the draft process, and he's no longer on the roster. So for the Commanders to kind of botch both the 1st and 2nd round of the 2022 draft, at least from a process standpoint, well, there was a reason that they selected selected number 2 in the 2024 draft, and I know Jaden Daniels made a lot of things right, but these are definitely draft regrets teams have years later, because the draft is how you build your team, and there's reasons that whenever you look at the teams that are selecting consistently top 5 or top 10, it's because they do dysfunctional things. And I know Commanders fans would like to forget about the Ron Rivera era, but the Emmanuel Forbes over Christian Gonzalez selection and then willingly trading back out of Chris Olave were two decisions that I completely disagreed with from the start. The biggest thing that I want to hammer home in today's video is it's easy to sit back and look at and say, man, we should have drafted Brock Purdy with a 4th round pick, much less the final pick in the draft, or even based on the production that he's had, a 1st round pick, or even Puka Nacua with a 1st round pick. But those guys fell in the draft for reasons that they did. I mean, obviously it's easy to sit back in hindsight and say, but from a process standpoint, that was what I wanted to highlight in today's video. And I will say, from a process standpoint, I fully agreed with what the Giants did in the 2022 draft in the 1st round, with selecting a pass rusher in Kayvon Thibodeaux and a pass protector in Evan Neal. And I was really hoping that Andrew Thomas and Evan Neal would be the tackle duo of the future in New York, and unfortunately that didn't work out. But they don't make today's video because, again, I agreed with the decisions that Joe Schoen made from a process standpoint. Now, it is unfortunate that Evan Neal became a draft bust for all the wrong reasons, and that he asked fans if they flip burgers and that whole thing, but the process itself was right, and that is one that I do agree with. Now, if there is one thing to nitpick from the 2022 draft for the Giants, I never agreed with selecting Wan'Dale Robinson over a player like George Pickens, and I think that decision could warrant some criticism. But with KT and Evan Neal specifically in the 1st round, again, everything that we knew pre-draft, I will go to battle and say that Kayvon Thibodeaux and Evan Neal, at least from a process standpoint, were the right decisions. That if you're going to criticize Joe Schoen as a GM, there are far bigger things that you could criticize him for, whether it was like Saquon go, or letting Daniel Jones go now that we've seen the success that he's had in Indy, or simply not helping him out as much as they could have during his time in New York. And there's been several players that have came out over the past year or two that, even before the success that Daniel Jones has had in Indy, that it was never a Daniel Jones problem. So if you want to criticize Joe Schoen, look a lot further than Kayvon Thibodeaux and Evan Neal, because again, I fully agreed with those decisions at the time, and from a process standpoint, I think they were the right decisions. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, please like the video and subscribe, as we are closing in at 215,000 subscribers, and I cannot thank you guys enough for the support. Thank you to Prize Picks for sponsoring today's video. I understand that that's not for everyone, but if it is, always play responsibly, and until next time, please be safe and have a great day. Love you guys.